Chapter 22. I don't wanna be an ace in the hole anymore.
I pushed my emotions off a bridge. I've been taking them hostage with a shotgun.
Izuku sighed into his coffee, taking comfort in the warmth of the mug between his hands. He distractedly watched the steam swirl lazily into the air and dissipate. It had been a while since he'd been to this cafe, even though it was close to his work. The little shop had only reminded him of the last time he'd been here with Katsuki. Katsuki stared at Izuku intently. His brow was furrowed, but he didn't look angry. If anything, he seemed uncertain. He hadn't yet spoken a word since they'd sat down together in the quiet cafe corner. The seconds ticked by painfully, each one an eternity. A date? Like hell. To Izuku, this was a last chance for Katsuki to try and salvage anything positive out of their strange and tumultuous relationship. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. Katsuki drummed his fingers on the table. Finally, he spoke. I messed up, he said simply. Izuku paused. Yes, he agreed. He took another sip of his coffee, unwilling to offer anything more. Katsuki seemed taken aback by his bluntness. He set his jaw. Izuku could have sworn he heard him curse under his breath. I shouldn't have yelled at you, he continued. I shouldn't have called you pathetic. Izuku waited, struggling to keep his expression impassive. It wasn't nothing, but at this point, it wasn't nearly enough. After a few more seconds passed, he cleared his throat. Okay, he said. Is that it? He stood up, ready to leave. Frick. No. Katsuki reflexively reached across the table and grabbed Izuku's wrist. He startled, instantly hating the way Katsuki's fingertips felt against his skin. Katsuki looked almost as surprised as him, but he maintained his composure. Izuku. He gritted his teeth. Let me finish. I'm trying. He hesitated. As unhappy as he was with Katsuki, he could see that he was being truthful. Besides, if he was being completely honest with himself, he wanted to know what else he had to say. He slowly sat back down. Katsuki exhaled and released his grip. Another moment passed. I miss you, he said. Izuku almost fell out of his chair. He stared at Katsuki, a confusing mess of emotions bubbling up within him. There was warmth, but there was also anger, and hurt. Frick you, he snapped. If you missed me, why didn't you call? Katsuki looked at him stupidly. Huh. If you missed me, then why didn't you freaking call? He noticed that his hands were shaking and quickly shoved them into his pockets. Katsuki frowned. You told me to have a nice life. So. Would you have answered? Izuku faltered. I don't know. Maybe. He glanced away. You could have at least tried. Katsuki knotted his brow. After a moment, he nodded, seeming to accept his words. Izuku could handle a loud Katsuki. An angry Katsuki. He didn't like this quieter, more contemplative one. It threw him off balance and only added to his frustrations. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. So, he said sharply. I guess you've been getting everything you wanted. New fans. A hit song. He gave him a pointed look. A front-page magazine feature. All you had to do was throw me under the bus. Katsuki scowled. The hell are you talking about? I wasn't throwing you under the bus. Then what were you doing? He waved an exasperated hand in the air. I don't know. Isn't this what you're supposed to do in situations like this? I thought it'd be a nice gesture. I thought you would appreciate it. Appreciate? Izuku slammed his hands down on the cafe table. You might have gotten me fired, Katsuki. Katsuki stared at him, perplexed. How the heck might I have gotten you fired? Izuku shook his head. You don't understand office politics. The editor-in-chief thought that I was manipulating the band to get a leg up at the beat. He carefully left out the romantic accusations that Nemuri had leveled against him. I could have warned you against it if you had called me first. Katsuki finally seemed to understand. Crap, he muttered. Crap. How bad is it? He sighed. I don't know. I'll find out soon enough. Katsuki groaned. God fricking dang it, he grumbled. Would this really have gone better if I'd called? Izuku took another sip of his coffee before responding. Probably, he said. I still don't know what this is, though. He shrugged. I wanted to make things up to you. Why? I already told you. Izuku stared him down. You wrote a song about me. You held me hostage at work. That's an awfully long way to go to repair a friendship. Well, you're not really a friend. He flinched. No, he replied darkly. I guess I'm not. Katsuki grimaced. That's not what I meant. He tugged his hair anxiously. Frick. This is really fricking hard. Izuku felt something well up inside of him but pushed it back down. Why? He asked. Why does it always have to be so hard? I don't know. He swallowed. I've been doing a lot of thinking and I think I've been doing everything wrong. Izuku frowned. What do you mean? I mean everything. Every fricking thing. You can't. Listen. Katsuki ran his hands through his hair. For the past 4 years, every waking minute of my life has revolved around the band, practicing, writing songs, planning tours, promoting ourselves, networking, figuring out how to make things work financially, getting into bigger and better venues. We made a lot of sacrifices, college, family, friends. I thought that if it was for the band, then it would be worth it in the end. That once we'd made it, everyone would see us and understand. He paused. Anything that wasn't for the band was a betrayal of everything we'd worked so hard for. I don't get it, Izuku said. If that was true, then why didn't you have a problem with Mina and Ajaru hooking up? That wasn't for the band. He waved his hand dismissively. That's different. I'm the leader. It's my job to make sure things work out. Besides, Crappy Hair had been making hard eyes at Pink Face since high school. It was fricking gross. Izuku stared at him incredulously. Maybe you're the frontman, but Mina and Ajaru are part of the anti-heroes too, he retorted. It should be all of your responsibility to make sure the band succeeds. It's stupid to put that on yourself. Don't call me stupid, Katsuki growled. It's always been my job to look after the band. He picked up his coffee cup then set it down again. Then again, if everything I do is supposed to be for the band, why did Drop Dead Gorgeous blow up? The one time I released something that wasn't meant for the anti-heroes. You weren't expecting it to blow up. Izuku was genuinely surprised by this revelation. Katsuki shook his head. Hell no. That crappy low-budget song? We were just messing around. The corners of Izuku's mouth twitched. A lot of people seemed to like your crappy low-budget song though. I know. He slammed his palm onto the table, rattling the mugs. Why that song? Why now? Why does everything lead back to you? Katsuki suddenly shut his mouth and looked away. Izuku's face tingled. He couldn't believe the words that were coming out of Katsuki's mouth. The urge to say something reassuring returned all too naturally to him. But at the same time, it's not really my job to figure that out for you. His words were harsh, but his tone was gentle. I know that, Katsuki grumbled. My point is that maybe my approach has been wrong from the start. Maybe it's okay to do things that aren't for the band. Maybe it could even be good for us. He frowned. I know that sounds kind of stupid. It doesn't really make sense to me. Actually, Izuku replied, I think that's one of the most logical things you've ever said. Katsuki blinked. What? No one can thrive on work alone. You'll burn yourself out. He looked at the dark bags under Katsuki's eyes. You've probably been burnt out for a while. It makes sense that changing strategies would be good for you and the band. You sound like Pink Face. Izuku bristled. And you sound like you've been making yourself miserable on purpose. Katsuki groaned. Crap. Maybe. He hesitated. This only happened because I took your advice. You said to create a whole bunch of stuff and see if anything sticks. I ended up writing a crap ton of songs. He shook his head in disgust. Most of them were terrible. I don't know how you work like that. Even Pink Face said they were too depressing, or stupid, or sappy. She found a couple of decent ones, though. It was her idea to film Drop Dead Gorgeous. He snorted. Guess we've got to make it a proper song now. Izuku found this oddly heartwarming. I find it hard to believe that you could write anything sappy. He paused. Wait. Who were you writing sappy songs about? Katsuki, realizing his mistake, stiffened. Not you, if that's what you're thinking. What were they about, then? F off. Show me them. Katsuki glared at him. Hell no. I'll burn them all first. Them all. How many songs did you write about me? Izuku nearly shrieked. His face was scarlet and his heart thumped wildly in his chest. Shut up. Katsuki's face was equally red. I didn't do crap and it's your freaking fault anyways. Several people in the cafe turned their heads to see what the commotion was about. Izuku found it hard to believe that this was his reality right now. Oh my god, he said to himself, trying to steady his voice. Katsuki leaned forward and buried his face in his hands. Izuku could see the flushed tips of his ears. Stop, he said hoarsely. It's freaking embarrassing. Izuku picked up his coffee mug with shaking hands. He took one long sip and then another, if only to calm his nerves. Why was he always like this with Katsuki? Even when he tried his best to keep a cool head, the blonde unraveled him effortlessly. He closed his eyes and tried to think. Okay, he finally said. You told me that you wanted to make amends. For what purpose? He gritted his teeth. I can't be your friend, Katsuki. Not after everything. Katsuki lowered his hands. He watched Izuku uncertainly, like he was gauging him. Maybe I don't want to be friends, he said. Izuku rejected his words before they had a chance to settle in. I don't know how to take that. Really? Izuku leveled him with a hard gaze. Katsuki frowned and looked at his hands. I'm no good at this crap. Ain't ever done this before. What? Apologize to someone. Izuku couldn't help himself. Don't be a smartass, Katsuki snapped. Any of this. Feelings stuff. Any of, he gestured roughly between himself and Izuku. With anyone. So Kirishima had been right. You've never been in a relationship, Izuku said slowly. Maybe he'd never pursued anyone romantically either. So what? That's not a big deal, is it? Depends who you ask. Izuku frowned. You said that you were focused on the band. If you had wanted to date, things would have been different. Katsuki was shaking his head. You don't get it. Izuku disregarded him. I'm sure that you've gotten around here and there either way, so it's not like you have no experience. There's always opportunities, like when you kissed that guy back at the club. That wasn't. So it hardly matters whether or not you've been in a serious. Frick, Katsuki's face was reddening again. Will you stop talking for one fricking second and listen to me? I'm telling you that I ain't ever done anything. With anyone. The gears in Izuku's head turned. Anything, he repeated. Katsuki shook his head slowly. The gears stopped turning. No, Izuku said. There's no way that was possible. Katsuki glared at him. The frick do you mean, no? Izuku stared at Katsuki. He met his gaze like it was a challenge. He didn't blink. Are you a virgin? He whispered. Katsuki's nostrils flared. He looked like a wild animal, ready to fight or flee. So what if I am? Izuku gawked at him. His brain struggled to process this piece of information. It went against everything he'd thought he'd known about Katsuki and people like him. He was handsome. Talented. Intelligent. Ambitious. It was unfathomable to him. The possibility had never crossed his mind for even the briefest of moments. However, even if he couldn't believe Katsuki's words, he could believe his pinched expression, the nervous tapping of his foot, and the way he shifted in his seat. He was clearly uncomfortable. Izuku was struck with a sudden sense of guilt. Oh, he said. He cleared his throat. Well. There's nothing wrong with that. If it makes you feel any better, he swallowed. I've never been with a guy before. You still don't get it. Katsuki was speaking quietly now. Even when I was a teenager, I was focused on other things. I knew I was into guys, but I never put any thought into it beyond that. I was never interested in dating and I used to think that it was because I had other priorities, but now I'm pretty sure it's just the way I was. Things were slowly starting to fall into place. It's not that you didn't have time to date, Izuku said. It's that you didn't want to. Katsuki sighed. Sort of. It was something I never even thought to want. He pressed his palms into his eyes tiredly. People expect me to be a certain way. To want certain things. They act like that's how I should be. Even you. Izuku felt that last remark like a gut punch. He couldn't deny the truth in Katsuki's words. But you're not. He shook his head. I wouldn't know how to be that way if I tried. Izuku thought for a moment. So. How does our situation fit into this? Katsuki lowered his hands. Exactly, he said. He pointed an accusing finger at him. You screwed me up. All of a sudden, I'm wanting different things than I have before. Feeling crap I ain't ever felt before. I'm writing all these crappy songs and... What? Izuku quickly wiped the grin off his face. Nothing, he said. Go ahead. He shrugged. That's it. I freaking like you. Izuku stared at him incredulously. After a long silence, he started to laugh. Katsuki's expression looked caught somewhere between confused and offended. Glad you think it's so freaking funny, he grumbled. Izuku didn't know whether he wanted to reassure Katsuki or smack him upside the head. I'm sorry, but you have to understand. When I told you how I felt months ago, you called me pathetic. I already said I shouldn't have done that. Besides, what was I supposed to do? 2 seconds earlier, you were screaming and shouting and getting all up in my face. I swear you don't even take the time to breathe when you get like that. Do you have any idea how freaking intimidating you are? Izuku's jaw dropped. Me? He asked, spluttering. He raised an indignant hand to his chest. I'm intimidating? That's rich, coming from you. You are intimidating, Katsuki argued. You never shut up. You don't give people time to think, let alone reply. You're pushy. You come on really freaking strong. You're handsy. Is this about Vegas? Because you initiated that. I kissed you, Katsuki said. I didn't ask to be groped. You pushed me onto the bed. What was I supposed to think? He growled. It's not like there was anywhere else to go in that tiny room. 5 more seconds and you would have had your hands down my freaking pants. Izuku opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. He thought about everything he'd been told. Is that why you freaked out? He asked. Katsuki grunted and averted his eyes. I guess, he muttered. Then I started thinking about how I was screwing everything up for the band. You wouldn't shut up and, he clenched his jaw. It's not your fault. But for Pete's sake. Give a guy a chance to think. Izuku said nothing. He'd spent so much time agonizing over what had happened in Vegas and yet he'd never thought to try and look at the situation from Katsuki's perspective. There were a number of things that would have been massively helpful for him to know, but that didn't change the fact that if he was being truly honest with himself, he'd never tried to see things from any point of view other than his own. His anger and hurt over the past few months began to subside, and in its place, something closer to sadness emerged. I didn't know, he finally said. If I had thought you were uncomfortable, I would have stopped. Sure, Katsuki scoffed. Kukin, Izuku said softly. I would have stopped. I would never intentionally do anything to make you or anyone else feel that way, ever. I wish that you had said something instead of losing it on me. Katsuki sighed. He suddenly looked very tired. Yeah, he said. I know. Izuku was starting to understand what Katsuki had been getting at. Maybe he wasn't a traditionally intimidating person, but he could see how someone might find him a lot to handle romantically. Especially if that person had no dating experience. Maybe he had some things to apologize for as well. I shouldn't have shouted at you at your show, he said. It was really hard seeing you kiss that guy. He paused, running a hand through his curls. My last girlfriend cheated on me. Katsuki's eyes widened. Crap. Izuku offered him a pained smile. I've had bad luck with relationships. Seeing you do that struck a nerve. I know we weren't together, but it still sucked. He sighed. I was upset and I could have handled the situation better. Katsuki shrugged. I was being he paused. I don't even know that guy's name. Never saw him before that night. Ain't seen him since. Are you trying to make me feel better? Izuku asked dryly. Just stating facts. He remained silent for a moment. There's something else I need to apologize for. I ain't looking for apologies. You were right. Izuku took his time with his words. I did think that you would be a certain way when it came to relationships. The fact that you're the lead singer of a punk band didn't help. He paused. I made all of these assumptions about you and I don't think any of them ended up being correct. He actually felt a little disappointed with himself. What's worse is I let my assumptions affect the way I interacted with you right from the start. I was wrong to put that on you. He smiled tentatively. Everyone is different and wants different things. Thanks for reminding me of that. Katsuki raised his eyebrows, visibly surprised. Izuku hesitated. It was probably none of his business, but... You don't have to answer this if you don't want to. Are you not interested in that type of relationship for yourself, at all, ever? Katsuki's shoulders stiffened. His face flushed. Dunno, he said after a moment. Sometimes I think with the right person. He glanced at Izuku, then quickly averted his eyes. It's hard to know for sure. He nodded. Okay, he said. I understand. Katsuki smirked humorlessly. Guess that'd be a deal breaker for most people. Izuku hummed thoughtfully. Maybe for some people. He thought for a moment. If I really liked someone, I think I'd give them a chance regardless. It's not like that's the only aspect of a relationship, you know? There's plenty of other things that are equally or more important. He looked away. Not that you were asking. Izuku could have sworn he saw the ghost of a smile flicker across Katsuki's lips. He noticed that his coffee was untouched. It was probably cold by now. Meanwhile, Izuku's was nearly empty. So, Katsuki said, changing the subject. You heard the song. He snorted. I think the entire city heard it. He couldn't begin to imagine what the viewership on it must look like by now. Did you like it? That was a question Izuku hadn't been expecting. He pressed his lips together to suppress the smile that wanted to form. I don't know, he said. I was mad at you when I first heard it. Maybe if I listened to it now, I'd feel differently. Katsuki tilted his head. You were mad at me, he repeated. You're not now. He shook his head. I'm a lot of things, but I don't think that I'm mad anymore. Frustrated? Yes. Disappointed over how things turned out? Yes. He'd been ready to walk out the second they'd entered the cafe, but now he was glad he'd stuck around. What about you? Katsuki was quiet for a moment. I was never mad at you, Izuku, he finally said. I didn't know how to deal with you. Izuku let that sink in. The admission felt heavy in and of itself. You know, he grimaced. You don't have to call me that. This might sound strange, but I think I got used to you calling me Deku. Katsuki's shoulders relaxed. Thank God, he said. Calling you Izuku feels weird. Like I'm in a business meeting or something. Izuku laughed despite himself. Katsuki grinned. Eventually his laughter subsided. God. What a day. Katsuki watched him contemplatively. When do you find out about your job? He deliberated. I guess once my boss sees the images from the photo shoot. Togata thought it could go either way. Katsuki winced. Izuku sighed. He reconsidered his earlier words. It's not entirely your fault that I'm in this situation, he admitted. I've been sneaking around behind my boss's back for the past couple of months and assisting Togata with some of his shoots. He chuckled humorlessly. Guess I'm not as clever as I thought, and she caught on. Katsuki's face transformed into the picture of outrage. You ace in the hole, he exclaimed. You made me feel like crap. I thought I'd gotten you fired. Well, you definitely made things worse. My boss and the editor-in-chief were super pissed at me over what you did. Katsuki shook his head. You're such a... Izuku chewed on his lip thoughtfully. I might leave, he said. Even if they want to keep me. He sighed. I'm sick to death of the beat. My boss admitted to me that she's been keeping me on beginner stuff because I'm good at it. I never thought I'd get held back because I was good at my job. Your boss sounds like an ace in the hole, Katsuki asserted. Quit, then. Tell her to go, herself on the way out. Izuku snorted. I'd rather not burn any bridges. He paused. I'll probably wait and see what happens with my photography project before making any final decisions. Katsuki perked up. You finished it? Izuku grinned. Yeah, he said. I think it turned out really well. Can I see it? He said. Maybe. When it comes out. When it comes out, he repeated. Izuku nodded. It's due to be released on Thursday. Outreach News bought it off me. Katsuki stared at him. You got picked up by Outreach News. Izuku's chest swelled with pride. Yeah, he said. They only bought the one project for now, but I guess if it's well received, there's a chance they'll buy another off me in the future or maybe hire me on assignment. He whistled. You've been busy. Izuku nodded, grinning from ear to ear. Katsuki looked genuinely impressed. He'd forgotten how much he enjoyed talking about his work with him. I have. He tapped his temple. My head's doing a lot better, too. So I feel pretty ready for a major change or two at this point. Katsuki leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. I'll have to keep an eye out for your story, then. Izuku gave him a look. I'd offer to send you the link, but you blocked my number. Oh, he said. I only had you blocked for like a day. Izuku stared at him in disbelief. He groaned and buried his face in his hands. I don't know whether I want to laugh or kill you. I'd like to see you try, he retorted half-heartedly. Izuku laughed bleakly. We really messed things up, didn't we? Katsuki fell silent. It wasn't all bad, was it? He sighed and lowered his hands. No, a lot of it was great. That's what makes this so hard. He closed his eyes and thought about everything that had happened over the past 8 months. From the moment they'd met, he'd viewed Katsuki through a certain lens. He had no one but himself to blame for that. However, Katsuki had no shortage of his own faults. His inability to communicate was a huge part of what had led them to this point. Yet, despite everything, here they were, talking about their projects and aspirations like it was the most natural thing in the world. Katsuki tapped his foot nervously. He took a deep breath, then decisively reached across the table and placed his hand on top of Izuku's. Izuku opened his eyes, startled. Do you think we could start over? He asked. The question immediately sent his heart into overdrive. Of course he still had feelings for Katsuki. It was all still there. He'd hated himself for it before, but now, he wasn't sure. He couldn't deny the way he felt when he looked at him. His touch still gave him butterflies. His intense gaze still made his spine tingle. His approval still meant the world to him. He was hurting, but Katsuki was too. It was clear that he'd been working through some things. Maybe he still was. Izuku only knew that at this moment, he was trying his best to repair their fractured relationship. He'd reached out and attempted to regain contact through a means that, while ill-conceived, had been well-intentioned. He was being honest about his feelings and opening up in ways that Izuku could have never imagined. He wanted Izuku to understand him better. It was easy to remember the heartache that Katsuki had caused him. The way he'd rejected him repeatedly. The way he'd insulted him when he'd confessed his feelings. The way he'd run hot one minute and cold the next. It was just as easy, however, to remember all the kindnesses he'd shown him. The advice he'd given him. The camera he'd bought him. The way he supported and believed in him. The way he'd worried about him when he'd gotten injured. The quieter moments they'd enjoyed, painting in his apartment and watching the sunset over the canyon. The playful teasing and occasional flirting. Izuku had never met anyone like Katsuki and probably never would again. What would happen if he gave him a final chance? Would he regret it? Would he regret not doing it? Katsuki watched him, patiently waiting for an answer. Izuku's feelings surrounding Katsuki were a mess. Did he still love him? He wasn't sure, but he wanted to find out. He cleared his throat. No, he said. Katsuki's face, which had remained serious but hopeful, fell. He nodded. Accepting Izuku's decision, he retracted his hand. Before he could fully retreat, though, Izuku retook his hand. Katsuki looked at him, his lips parted in surprise. I don't want to start over, he said. We've been through too much together. It would be impossible to forget everything. Besides, I don't want to. So, he took a breath to steady himself. Maybe instead of starting over, we could turn the page. Katsuki's brow furrowed. Turn the page, he repeated. Okay. How do we do that? He smiled. Well, for starters, I thought you said that you wanted to take me on a date. It'd be nice to go on a proper one instead of whatever this is. Katsuki's forlorn expression began to change. A slow grin spread across his face. I guess this makes for a pretty lousy date, he admitted. He scratched his head, thinking. Well, heck. You hungry? Izuku's smile widened. Katsuki's grin was contagious. I could eat, he said. You're not too busy. No more than I ever am, he replied. His eyes sparkled with withheld amusement. Frick, Deku. Do you seriously think I'm gonna tell you I'm busy right now? I took a bath in Vaseline for you today. I'm pretty sure I still have some behind my ears. Izuku laughed. Well, at least you got something worthwhile out of it, right? He'd been talking about the photo shoot, but the way that Katsuki looked at him made him think he'd interpreted the comment differently. He reddened. Hell yeah, Katsuki said. I did. Katsuki fumbled his apartment door open, his lips pressed firmly against Izuku's. It was dark but peaceful inside the suite. Izuku was only vaguely aware of how late they'd ended up staying out. Dinner had been leisurely and they'd walked around for a while afterwards. The moon was already high in the sky when they'd decided to head back. Katsuki locked the door behind them while he continued the kiss, snaking his arm around Izuku's waist. Izuku returned the gesture, enjoying their closeness and the way that Katsuki's mouth made him feel breathless and giddy. "Is this okay?" he asked quietly. "Yeah," Katsuki replied softly. Izuku nodded and kissed him again. This felt nothing like the kisses they'd exchanged in the past. Those had been messy, encouraged by alcohol and imbued with a sense of urgency and a hint of desperation. This felt relaxed and controlled. Slower and more sensual than any of their prior moments of intimacy. Izuku was brought out of his drifting thoughts when he felt something brush against his calf. He broke the kiss and looked down. A familiar tabby cat stared up at him, her eyes shining. She meowed quietly. "Hey Missy," he murmured fondly, reaching down to her to pet her head. Missy hissed at him and fled. He chuckled. "Guess some things never change." "Guess not," Katsuki replied disinterestedly. He kissed Izuku again. Izuku smiled against his mouth and lazily wrapped his arms around his shoulders. Katsuki responded by pulling him closer and leading him inside the apartment. Izuku wasn't sure how much time had passed, but at some point they'd ended up on the couch. Katsuki was stroking the back of his neck and one of Izuku's legs was draped across his thighs. Katsuki had been tentative at first, but he'd grown more confident the more that Izuku had allowed him to take the lead. "You can stay the night," Katsuki said between breaths. "If you want." Izuku nodded and pressed a series of soft kisses along his jawline. He understood now that there wasn't any deeper meaning behind his words. It was late and he was certain that Katsuki was enjoying this almost as much as he was. Neither of them were eager to part ways anytime soon. He ran his hands through Katsuki's hair. This felt nice. This felt safe. Taking things slow was totally fine with him. He could do this forever. Izuku didn't know what the next day would bring for him. Instead of worrying, though, he simply allowed himself to enjoy the moment. He reveled in Katsuki's soft touches and bade a final farewell to all of his prior expectations. For now, this was more than enough.